The morning of June 3, 1942, found Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's first air fleet cutting through the Pacific swells like a sword through silk. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, moved in formation, their flight decks bristling with the Empire's finest aircraft. The same carriers that had delivered the devastating blow to Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now sailed toward what Imperial headquarters believed would be Japan's crowning victory in the Pacific. Vice Admiral William Frederick Halsey Jr.'s absence from the American fleet due to a skin condition had placed the burden of command on Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, a cautious tactician who preferred calculated risks to bold gambits. Unknown to the approaching Japanese armada, Spruance's Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, lay in wait northeast of Midway Atoll. The Americans had broken Japan's naval code, transforming what should have been a surprise attack into an elaborate trap. Captain Joseph John Rochefort's team at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had performed what many considered impossible. They had cracked the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code. The intelligence breakthrough revealed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's ambitious plan to lure the remaining American fleet into a decisive battle where Japan's superior numbers would crush American resistance once and for all. Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, believed that capturing Midway would force the American Pacific Fleet into a final confrontation where Japan could destroy it completely. The strategic importance of Midway could not be overstated. This tiny coral atoll, consisting of 2 small islands barely 6 miles across, sat like a sentinel 1,100 miles northwest of Honolulu. Its airfield provided the Americans with an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Central Pacific, while its capture would give Japan a forward base from which to threaten Hawaii itself. For the Japanese, Midway represented the key to controlling the entire Pacific Ocean. As dawn broke on June 4th, the Japanese strike force approached its target with confidence, born of 6 months of unbroken victories. From the Aleutians to the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces had swept all before them. The attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the American battle fleet, while subsequent victories at Wake Island, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies had established Japanese dominance across the Western Pacific. Admiral Nagumo's pilots had every reason to believe that Midway would be another easy conquest. According to historical accounts documented in Walter Lord's Incredible Victory, the Japanese plan called for a dawn attack on Midway's defenses, followed by a landing operation that would secure the atoll within hours. The American fleet, if it dared to respond, would face the combined might of Yamamoto's entire armada, a force that included 11 battleships, 8 aircraft carriers, and over 20 cruisers and destroyers. But the Americans were ready. Task Force 17, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and centered on the hastily repaired carrier Yorktown, had joined Spruance's force northeast of Midway. Together, the 3 American carriers carried fewer than 250 aircraft compared to Japan's 420, yet they possessed the crucial advantage of surprise and position. The stage was set for what would become the most decisive naval battle in the Pacific War. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron adjusted his flight goggles as Torpedo Squadron 8 prepared for what would become one of the most heroic and tragic missions in naval aviation history. The Grumman TBF Avengers and Douglas TBD Devastators of his squadron were obsolete aircraft facing the most modern fighters in the Japanese Navy, yet Waldron knew that their sacrifice might create the opening American dive bombers needed. The Japanese attack on Midway had begun at dawn, with 108 aircraft from Nagumo's carriers striking the atoll's defenses. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the assault, his dive bombers and fighters sweeping over the tiny islands like a swarm of steel hornets. The Marine defenders, flying obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters and Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, rose to meet them in what could only be described as aerial slaughter. Major Lofton Russell Henderson's Marine Fighter Squadron 221 fought with desperate courage, but their Buffalo fighters were no match for the Mitsubishi Zero. The Japanese fighters, piloted by veterans of Pearl Harbor and countless Pacific battles, carved through the American formation with devastating efficiency. Henderson himself was shot down within minutes, his death symbolizing the sacrifice of Marines who knew they were outmatched but refused to yield. On Midway itself, The Japanese bombs found their targets with precision. The power plant erupted. In flames, the seaplane hangar collapsed in a shower of concrete and twisted metal, and the fuel storage tanks sent pillars of black smoke into the morning sky. Yet, the airfield remained operational, and the garrison's anti-aircraft guns continued to rake the sky with deadly fire. Admiral Nagumo faced his first crucial decision as reports from Tominaga indicated that a second strike would be necessary to neutralize Midway's defenses completely. The Japanese admiral ordered his reserve aircraft, armed with armor-piercing bombs for use against American ships, to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second attack on the island. This decision would prove catastrophic, as it caught the Japanese carriers in the vulnerable process of rearming when American attacks began. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Elbert Lindsay's Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise launched their attack at 7:30 in the morning, followed by Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet. The American torpedo bombers approached their targets in 3 separate waves, their obsolete aircraft struggling to maintain formation against the faster Japanese fighters. The massacre was swift and merciless. Waldron's entire squadron was annihilated, with only Ensign George Hanson Gay surviving to witness the battle from his life raft. Lindsay's squadron suffered similar losses, with only 4 of 14 aircraft returning to Enterprise. The torpedo attacks appeared to be complete failures, achieving no hits while losing nearly 30 aircraft and their irreplaceable crews. But the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons served a crucial purpose that would not become apparent until later. The low-level attacks had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the carriers vulnerable to high-altitude attack. Moreover, the desperate courage of the American airmen had shaken Japanese confidence and disrupted their careful timing. As documented in Gordon Prange's Miracle at Midway, the Japanese carriers found themselves caught in the worst possible situation. Flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, while American dive bombers approached from high altitude with the morning sun at their backs. The first phase of the Battle of Midway had ended with apparent Japanese victory, but the true test was yet to come. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey's decision to extend his search beyond the planned coordinates would alter the course of the Pacific War. Leading Enterprise's Dive Bomber Squadron 6, McCluskey had burned precious fuel, searching for the Japanese fleet when he spotted the white wake of destroyer Arashi racing north to rejoin the main force. That single vessel led him directly to Admiral Nagumo's carriers. At 10:24 on the morning of June 4, 1942, McCluskey's dive bombers rolled into their attack dives just as Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie's squadron from Yorktown approached from a different angle. The timing was purely coincidental, but it proved devastating. The Japanese carriers, caught with their flight decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, were about to experience what naval historians would call 5 fatal minutes. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, received the first blow. Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck near the aft elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among stored torpedoes and bombs. The explosion triggered a chain reaction that turned the carrier into an inferno within minutes. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara, watched in horror as his most experienced carrier was consumed by flames. Kaga suffered an even more devastating fate. 3 bombs from McCluskey's squadron struck the massive carrier in rapid succession. The first destroyed the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his senior officers. The second and third bombs penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar spaces, where they ignited aviation fuel and ordnance. The resulting explosions lifted the forward flight deck like a giant hand, while secondary detonations continued to rack the ship. Soryu, smallest of the Japanese carriers, fell victim to Leslie's squadron from Yorktown. 3 dive bombers penetrated the combat air patrol and delivered their bombs with deadly accuracy. The explosions occurred almost simultaneously, and within 20 minutes the carrier was dead in the water, her flight deck buckled, and her hangar, spaces filled with flame and smoke. The destruction was so rapid and complete that it stunned both sides. In the space of 5 minutes, Japan had lost 3/4 of its striking force and hundreds of its most experienced pilots and aircrew. The same carriers that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months were now burning wrecks, their aircraft either destroyed or circling helplessly, as their homes died beneath them. Captain Taman Yamaguchi aboard the surviving carrier Hiryu immediately launched a counterstrike. His bombers and fighters, among the last operational aircraft in the Japanese fleet, targeted Yorktown with the fury of men seeking revenge. The attack, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, achieved what the Japanese desperately needed: a successful strike against an American carrier. Yorktown, already damaged from the Coral Sea battle and hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor, absorbed 3 bomb hits that knocked out her boilers and started serious fires. The carrier listed heavily to port and appeared to be sinking. Admiral Fletcher, his flagship crippled, transferred operational command to Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise, yet even as Yorktown burned, her damage control parties worked miracles. Chief Petty Officer John Samuel McCain Sr. led efforts that gradually restored power and reduced the list. Within 2 hours, the carrier was making 20 knots and appeared to be saved. This remarkable recovery would lead Japanese pilots to believe they had encountered a second American carrier when they returned for another attack. Historical analysis by Samuel Eliot Morison in The Two-Ocean War emphasizes how these 5 minutes at Midway represented the turning point not just of the battle, but of the entire Pacific War. Japan's carefully husbanded carrier aviation force, built up over 2 decades, was shattered in moments by American bombs. The initiative in the Pacific had passed to the Americans, though the battle was far from over. Captain Taman Yamaguchi stood on Hiryu's bridge, his carrier now the sole surviving member of the once mighty 1st Air Fleet. Known throughout the Imperial Navy for his aggressive tactics and unwavering determination, Yamaguchi embodied the samurai spirit that had driven Japan's early Pacific victories. Now, with 3 sister carriers burning on the horizon, he prepared to make his final stand. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pacific as Hiryu's remaining aircraft prepared for what everyone knew would be a desperate mission. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, wounded in the morning attack on Midway, volunteered to lead the strike despite his injuries. His Nakajima B-5N Kate bomber bore damage from American anti-aircraft fire and fuel leaked from its punctured tanks, yet he refused to be left behind. Tominaga's strike force of 10 bombers and 6 fighters found Yorktown just as her damage control parties had restored the carrier to fighting condition. The Japanese pilots, believing they faced a fresh American carrier, attacked with the precision that had made them feared throughout the Pacific. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, causing massive flooding and knocking out all power. The great carrier, veteran of Coral Sea and now twice damaged at Midway, began listing heavily to port. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, fearing his ship might capsize, gave the order to abandon ship. Thousands of sailors slid down ropes or jumped into the oil-slicked waters, where destroyers waited to pluck them from the sea. Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise now faced a crucial decision. His remaining dive bombers had been searching for the Japanese fleet, and fuel was running critically low. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher's squadron from Enterprise and Lieutenant Commander DeWitt Wood Shumway's squadron from Hornet had been airborne for hours, their fuel gauges approaching empty when they finally spotted Hiryu. The attack that followed epitomized American determination and skill. Gallagher's dive bombers rolled into their attack runs just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession, the explosions echoing across the Pacific like thunder. The flight deck erupted in flame, and secondary explosions from stored ordnance continued for hours. Captain Yamaguchi, his ship dying beneath him, sent a final message to Admiral Yamamoto. "Hiryu badly damaged. We are preparing to ram enemy carriers." It was a gesture both futile and magnificent, embodying the warrior code that had driven Japan to early victories, but now led to inevitable destruction. As darkness fell on June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning or sinking. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu had already been abandoned, their crews rescued by escorting destroyers. Hiryu continued to burn through the night, her magazines exploding periodically in brilliant flashes that illuminated the surrounding sea. The human cost was staggering. Japan lost not only 4 irreplaceable carriers, but also over 3,000 experienced naval personnel, including many of the pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor. These were men whose skills had been honed through years of training and combat experience that could not be quickly replaced. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, slowly realized that his grand strategy had failed catastrophically. The plan to lure the American fleet into a decisive battle had succeeded, but the result was the opposite of what he had intended. Instead of destroying American naval power, Japan had sacrificed its own most valuable assets. According to accounts in Mitsuo Fuchida's Midway, the Battle That Doomed Japan, Yamamoto seriously considered using his remaining battleships to shell Midway in a final desperate gambit. The massive Yamato, largest battleship ever built, could have reduced the atoll to rubble with her 18-inch guns. But without air cover, such an attack would have been suicide. The rising sun was setting on Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto faced the most difficult decision of his distinguished naval career as reports of the disaster reached him aboard the super battleship Yamato. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild for only 6 months to a year, now confronted the reality that his prediction was coming true ahead of schedule. The combined fleet commander had positioned himself 300 miles west of the action, expecting to close with the retreating American forces after Nagumo's carriers had crippled them. Instead, his scout planes reported 4 Japanese carriers burning or sunk, while American forces remained largely intact. The carefully orchestrated plan that was supposed to deliver the decisive blow in the Pacific had become Japan's greatest naval disaster. Yamamoto's immediate concern was salvaging what remained of his force. The heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, attempting to withdraw from the battle area, had collided during a sharp turn to avoid submarine attack. Mogami's bow was crushed, and both ships were reduced to 15 knots, making them prime targets for American air attacks come morning. Captain Richard Eugene Fleming of Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 would earn posthumous fame for his attack on these damaged cruisers. Flying an obsolete Douglas SBD Dauntless, Fleming dove through intense anti-aircraft fire to score direct hits on Mikuma. His aircraft, damaged by enemy fire, crashed into the cruiser's after-turret in what appeared to be a deliberate ramming attack. The explosion and resulting fires eventually sank the heavy cruiser. Meanwhile, the drama of Yorktown continued to unfold. The carrier, abandoned and apparently sinking, had been taken in tow by the minesweeper Vireo. Damage control parties returned to the ship and began the Herculean task of saving her. Throughout the night of June 4th and into June 5th, sailors worked to repair the massive torpedo damage and restore the carrier's stability. The Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the American fleet since the battle began. In the early morning hours of June 6th, Tanabe spotted what appeared to be an intact American carrier under tow. The submarine's periscope revealed Yorktown, her flight deck clear, and her hull riding higher in the water than when last seen. Tanabe's attack was perfectly executed. 4 torpedoes left the submarine's tubes, their wakes clearly visible in the morning light. 2 struck Yorktown, causing massive new flooding that doomed the carrier. The 3rd torpedo struck the destroyer Hammond, which was alongside providing power and assistance. The destroyer broke in half and sank within minutes, taking 81 sailors with her. Yorktown's final moments were witnessed by hundreds of American sailors who had fought to save her. The great carrier, which had survived Coral Sea and 2 attacks at Midway, finally succumbed to her wounds at dawn on June 7th. She rolled slowly to port and disappeared beneath the Pacific swells, taking with her the last American carrier loss of the Midway battle. Admiral Spruance, now in undisputed command of American forces, faced his own crucial decisions. His aircraft had located the damaged Japanese cruisers, and his pilots were eager to complete the destruction of Yamamoto's fleet. Yet fuel shortages and the long distance from Pearl Harbor meant that any pursuit carried significant risks. The final air attacks of the battle came on June 6th, as American dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet pursued the retreating Japanese ships. Besides sinking Mikuma, the attacks damaged several destroyers and forced Yamamoto to abandon any thought of renewing the offensive. As documented in John Keegan's The Price of Admiralty, the strategic implications of Midway were immediately apparent to both sides. Japan had lost not just 4 carriers, but the irreplaceable core of its naval aviation force. The pilots, mechanics, and support personnel who had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible were now at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, and Japan would spend the remainder of the war on the defensive. The silence that settled over the Pacific on June 7, 1942, was deafening after 4 days of thunderous combat. Where once the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy had ruled supreme, now only scattered debris and oil slicks marked the graves of 4 aircraft carriers and thousands of the Emperor's finest sailors. The Battle of Midway was over, and with it died Japan's hopes of decisive victory in the Pacific. Admiral Chester William Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, received the first reports of the battle's outcome in his headquarters at Pearl Harbor. The spare, precise language of military communications could not disguise the magnitude of the American victory. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, 1 American carrier lost, and the initiative in the Pacific War had passed permanently to the United States. The human cost of the battle reflected its strategic importance. Japan lost approximately 3,057 personnel, including many of the veteran pilots who had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor. America's losses, while significant, were far lighter, 307 killed and the loss of Yorktown. More importantly, the core of American naval aviation remained intact and would form the foundation for future offensives. Emperor Hirohito, when informed of the disaster, reportedly remained silent for several minutes before asking how such a defeat was possible. The divine wind that was supposed to protect Japan had failed at the crucial moment, and the rising sun's expansion across the Pacific had met an immovable barrier at a tiny coral atoll most Japanese had never heard of before. June 4th. Admiral Yamamoto's prediction that Japan could run wild for 6 months had proven tragically accurate. Exactly 6 months and 1 day after Pearl Harbor, the tide of war had turned at Midway. The combined fleet commander, architect of Japan's early successes, now faced the grim task of conducting a defensive war with diminished resources against an increasingly powerful enemy. The industrial implications of Midway were perhaps even more significant than the immediate tactical results. Japan's shipyards, already strained by wartime demands, could not quickly replace 4 fleet carriers. The specialized aircraft and trained pilots were even more irreplaceable. America, meanwhile, was beginning to hit its production stride, with new Essex-class carriers and thousands of newly trained pilots entering service monthly. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and was supposed to command the airstrike at Midway before appendicitis grounded him, later wrote that Midway was the beginning of the end for Japan. The strategic balance in the Pacific, so carefully tilted in Japan's favor by the Pearl Harbor attack, had swung decisively toward America. The psychological impact of the defeat reverberated throughout the Japanese Empire. For the first time, since the war began, Japanese forces had suffered a clear, undeniable defeat. The myth of Japanese invincibility, so crucial to maintaining morale across the far-flung empire, lay shattered on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean alongside Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. American intelligence, having proven its worth by breaking the Japanese naval code, now turned its attention to exploiting Japan's future plans. The code breakers who had made victory at Midway possible would continue to provide crucial intelligence throughout the war, turning Japan's own communications into weapons against the empire. The Battle of Midway established the pattern that would define the remainder of the Pacific War. Japan, forced onto the defensive, would fight with characteristic courage and determination, but always with diminishing resources against an enemy whose strength grew with each passing month. The 6 months of Japanese supremacy were over, and the long road to Tokyo Bay had begun. As the sun set on June 7, 1942, the Pacific Ocean looked the same as it had a week earlier. But everything had changed. Japan's thrust into the Pacific had indeed met Midway's wall, and that wall had held firm, turning the tide of the greatest war in human history. The morning of June 8, 1942, dawned over a Pacific Ocean forever changed by 4 days of unprecedented naval warfare. As rescue ships searched the debris-scattered waters for survivors, the full magnitude of the Battle of Midway began to emerge from the smoke and chaos of combat. What had begun as Japan's ambitious attempt to eliminate American naval power had, instead, become the empire's most devastating defeat. In Washington, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received Admiral Ernest Joseph King's preliminary report with quiet satisfaction. The president, who had maintained unwavering confidence in America's ultimate victory despite 18 months of disasters and defeats, recognized immediately that Midway represented far more than a tactical success. The strategic initiative in the Pacific, lost so dramatically at Pearl Harbor, had been decisively regained. The intelligence triumph that made Midway possible would remain classified for decades, but its implications were immediately apparent to those who understood its significance. Commander Joseph John Rochefort's team at Station Hypo had accomplished what many thought impossible. They had read the enemy's mail and turned Japan's own plans against the Empire. This intelligence advantage would prove crucial in subsequent campaigns across the Pacific. Admiral William Frederick Halsey, Jr., recovering from his skin condition that had kept him from commanding at Midway, summed up the battle's significance. With characteristic bluntness, "The Japs have been stopped." Indeed they had, but the cost of stopping them had been paid primarily in Japanese blood and steel. The 4 carriers that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months now rested on the ocean floor, their steel hulks serving as monuments to the fallen warriors of both nations. The strategic consequences of Midway rippled across the global conflict. Hitler's Germany, counting on Japanese pressure to prevent American reinforcement of Europe, now faced the prospect of fighting a 2-front war against an America freed from the immediate threat in the Pacific. The planned Japanese expansion toward Australia and New Zealand died with the carriers at Midway, allowing Allied forces to begin planning offensive operations. For Japan, the defeat necessitated a complete re-evaluation of strategy. The southern resource area that had been seized with such apparent ease now had to be defended with diminished forces against an enemy whose strength was growing daily. The scattered garrisons across the Pacific, from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, would have to hold their positions without the naval air support that had made Japanese expansion possible. The human stories emerging from Midway revealed both the heroism and tragedy inherent in warfare. Ensign George Hanson Gay, sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent 30 hours floating in his life raft before rescue, witnessing the destruction of the Japanese carriers from his unique vantage point. His survival and testimony provided invaluable intelligence about Japanese damage control procedures and combat effectiveness. Captain Taman Yamaguchi's decision to go down with Hiryu exemplified the warrior code that drove Japanese fighting men throughout the war. His final message, refusing rescue and choosing death over the shame of defeat, represented both the nobility and futility of such absolute dedication. Similar scenes would be repeated thousands of times as the war progressed, with Japanese commanders choosing death over surrender. The technical lessons learned at Midway would influence naval warfare for generations. The vulnerability of aircraft carriers when caught with armed and fueled aircraft on deck led to improved damage control procedures and deck protection. The importance of radar, which had given American fighters crucial early warning, accelerated development of electronic warfare capabilities on both sides. Perhaps most significantly, Midway demonstrated that intelligence, properly utilized, could overcome numerical disadvantage and turn the tide of battle. The codebreakers who made victory possible worked in anonymity, their contribution known only to a handful of senior commanders. Their success proved that in modern warfare, information could be as powerful as battleships, as documented in various post-war analyses, including those found in the Naval War College Review. The Battle of Midway marked the point where American industrial capacity began to assert itself decisively in the Pacific theater. The carriers lost by Japan could not be quickly replaced, while American shipyards were already launching the vessels that would carry the war to Japan's home islands. The setting sun on June 8, 1942, marked the end of Japan's Pacific Empire's expansion and the beginning of its contraction. Midway's wall had held, and Japan's thrust into the Pacific had been not merely stopped, but shattered. The thunder of battle would continue for 3 more years, but the outcome was no longer truly in doubt.